reminding me to report. Thank you for support from the local Alzheimer's Association, who reached out to us and has provided us with a lot of information in all of our stores for local resources to assist people either who are caregivers or who are dealing with Alzheimer's, who are looking for support groups or education. That information is available, and I will be dropping that link into the bio or into our chat. So now that I'm done with my bit, thank you all for joining us. I am going to hand this over to Dr. Stephen Rames.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm not a doctor, though I've played one on TV. We appreciate Rediscovered Books for hosting this event. I'm actually the director of the Ada County Medical Society. We're a local professional membership association with over 2,700 physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, medical residents, and students in Ada County. I'm really pleased to be welcoming back to Boise Dr. Jason Karlawish, who appeared at our annual meeting last October virtually. Unfortunately, because of the Delta spike, we did have to virtualize that event, but we're really glad to have this conversation today with so many community members. Dr. Karlawish is a professor of medicine, medical ethics, and health policy and neurology at the University of Pennsylvania, and the co-director of the Penn Memory Center, where he cares for patients. He researches and writes about issues at the intersections of bioethics, aging, and the neurosciences. As you know, he is the author of The Problem of Alzheimer's: How Science, Culture, and Politics Turned a Rare Disease into a Crisis, and What We Can Do About It. The book is part case study, part meditation on the past, present, and future of the disease. If you haven't finished the book, I hope you will. It traces Alzheimer's from the beginning to its recognition as a crisis and takes us inside laboratories, homes, caregiver support groups, and progressive care communities, and his own practice at Penn Memory Center. I want to thank our community sponsor, Idaho Central Credit Union. We were able to distribute about 100 of these books in our community at no cost. So we're really grateful for them, and also for the support of the Boise State University Center for the Study of Aging and the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare's Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementias program. They were both supporters of our fall program for this. I'd like to introduce now our moderator for today's conversation, Dr. Susan Melchiori. She joins us from Coeur d'Alene, where she's the medical director for the On-Site for Seniors program and the North Idaho Memory Clinic. She's a strong leader on caring for the aging in North Idaho. She also serves at the Kootenai Family Medicine Residency Geriatrics faculty. So she'll lead our conversation today. And as Rebecca said, if you have questions, you can raise your digital Zoom hand, or you can type that you would like to be called on and ask a question, or just type your question and we'll moderate those questions as they come up. Dr. Karlawish, Dr. Melchiori, welcome to you both. The conversation is yours.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Yes. And also thank you to Rebecca and Rediscovered Books and all the people that are participating. This is fantastic to have the audience participation. And especially thank you to Dr. Karlawish for this wonderful book. It's a great privilege and a blessing for me to be able to be invited to help facilitate this conversation today, especially about your latest book, The Problem of Alzheimer's. It's really a whirlwind story showing off the landscape that has become Alzheimer's disease over the past 100 years. You know, it weaves a tapestry of, scientific discovery, political policy twists, historic milestones, cultural revolutions, and even personal triumphs and tragedies. I found it fascinating. Each page was either, yes, that's exactly what it's like, or the next page, wow, I didn't know that. So it just kept me reading. And I think this would draw a wide audience, really. It's fascinating reading. What was your motivation in writing such a rich story on the history and becoming of Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah, it was years in the making. Great to see everyone, by the way. Greetings. I'm in my study in Philadelphia, where I live. I live in Philadelphia. I spent a lot of time in my study, but I don't live there. It snowed here. We got about 5 inches. And this is actually where I wrote the book, most of it, as well as back when we used to travel, airplanes and hotel rooms. Yeah, years ago, I thought of the idea of writing a book about Alzheimer's. I got to write a book about Alzheimer's. That was my focus. And a lot of it was coming out of my experiences as a clinician, diagnosing and treating patients, and a bit then as a researcher seeing something happen. So at first it was going to be a book called like My Profession, Confessions of an Alzheimer's. That was the working title. Sort of a play on profession and confession, like, what's this disease like, etc. And then I realized there was a bigger story going on. And the bigger story was that I was living through a revolution in the disease. Namely, when I started out as a physician, you had to have dementia, disabling cognitive impairments, to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But in my practice, as it was unfolding in the early 21st century, I was clearly witnessing a transformation. Namely, we were being able to diagnose the disease before you had dementia. That was the promise of our research. And so I realized that there was this thing called the House of Alzheimer's. And I like that word, that term, that phrase, because what I was trying to capture was two meanings of the idea of a house. Namely, if you think about a house, it's a building that you build, you design it. There's no doubt that human artifice is at work to design and build a house. It's a constructed thing, quite literally. But if you also think about a house, and my point was that Alzheimer's was being reconstructed by our research. But the other meaning of a house is that it's a place where you dwell, where you'd like to feel safe at home on a day like today in Philadelphia, warm and out of the storm. And I wanted to capture the idea that we needed to think about what is this house that we want to create for people to live in, people living with Alzheimer's and their caregivers. And so I thought that was a great title, The House of Alzheimer's. And then the final iteration was, as I was finishing the book, I realized this disease really is a crisis. And I need to capture that idea of crisis and then try to give people some idea of why it's a crisis and what we can do about it. And so in summary, the book went from being a personal kind of set of stories, which would have been nice, but whatever, kind of self-referential, to being a book that tried to sort of tell what's happened over the course of the 20th into the 21st century that turned a rare disease into a very common disease, and then all of a sudden into a crisis. And then finally to offer some sense, some idea, concrete ideas for what we can do about it to address the crisis. And the rest followed. I wrote the book probably in about a year and a half once I kind of put that all together. It really came out, at that point, it was fun to write. I actually missed writing it. And the rest is, now it's out.
Yeah, well, I think you accomplished that. That's a great analogy, the house, and yes, definitely successful. I wanted to talk a bit about some of the historical milestones that you point out in the book that have impacted the course of Alzheimer's disease and just the discoveries. You go through in fascinating detail how different historic events shaped how we diagnose and look at brain health nowadays. From one of the pages, I'll just kind of summarize some of these events. You talk about the collapse of German society, 2 world wars, anti-Semitism, Freudianism, that psychodynamic theory of brain diseases, the collapse of the asylum as a site for research, declining numbers of younger adults to care for those folks affected, and even bipartisan battles over the proper role of the state, of women, the responsibility of the family. There's just huge, diverse research on this that goes into shaping where we're at today. As you looked into this, I'm amazed you did it in a year and a half. What stood out as some of the most amazing or surprising events that impacted this unfolding as we see it today?
I think there was the course of the 20th into the 21st century that really got us to where we are today, or failed to get us to where we could have been today if these events hadn't happened. The first takes us to the Kaiser's Germany, early 20th century. While Germany was ruled by the Kaiser, as just to give you a sense of time, there were actually spectacular advances being made in what we would now call neuropathology, neurology, and psychiatry. The disciplines were named differently. That's not worth going into. And we know of one of those, many of you know of one of those physicians who did that research and work, Dr. Alois Alzheimer's, for whom the disease bears his name. But there were other physicians, some of whom, no offense to Alois, but were probably better researchers, like Oscar Fischer. Anyway, these German researchers, German nationality, German language, German culture, really were the singular group in the world kind of thinking very thoughtfully about diseases in older adults who had dementia. and questioning dogmas that it's just senility caused by extreme aging. And they were really doing work that was really quite adventurous, thoughtful, creative work. The problem, of course, is they were all German. No offense to Germans, but as we all know, around about 1914, as my grandfather used to say, things went to hell in a handbasket. And it only got worse over the ensuing decades. As we know, Germany had a period of economic and social collapse over the 20s. The 30s, of course, were dreadful. Oscar Fischer, who's an unsung hero, would be imprisoned in Theresienstadt prison and killed by the Gestapo because he was a Jew. So I hold him out as an example of an unsung hero. My point is this, is that it's hard to say what would have happened if World War I hadn't happened and therefore World War II, et cetera. But I can say that because those events happened, a very spectacular progress in science was just shut down. And I chronicle that in the book, such that by the time the 70s came, older adults with disabling cognitive impairments, with dementia, were kind of living in the dark ages, just ignored by medicine, ignored by society. They were just family problems. And then the second big event occurred. And the second big event is essentially a set of cultural events. At the beginning of the 20th century, in most countries, even liberal democracies, people were very much pigeonholed by their status. So for example, if you were a woman in America in the 20th century beginning, there were things you just couldn't do. Certain kinds of jobs and careers that were just not available to you. If you were married, you were effectively the property of your husband under the law of coverture. You couldn't get credit unless he granted to you. You couldn't vote until about 1922 or so. If you were of color, things were even, well, I won't say even worse. They were worse in a different way, but they were bad. Depending on where you lived, you couldn't drink from a water fountain, go to a restaurant, be admitted to a college. Anyway, the point I'm trying to get at is all of that changed fairly dramatically over the course of the 20th century with the rise of essentially the principle that people have an autonomy that ought to be respected. They have free will that they should be allowed to exercise. And a series of largely cultural and legal events transformed American society such that people all had free and equal access to live the lives they wanted. I lay out in the book how I think that cultural transformation made the loss of autonomy with aging because of senility simply unacceptable. And together with scientific advances, transformed senility into a disease, and that disease was labeled Alzheimer's disease. And so that's the second big event. It's largely a cultural event, that it just is unacceptable to lose your autonomy with aging, especially if there's something that you can do about it, like go after the disease that's causing it, the disease of Alzheimer's. And then the third event really is the story of the last bit of the 20th century into the 21st century. And it's a very American story, but I think it's a story that is kind of universal across other countries as well, liberal democracies, namely the pitched battles that would occur and still are occurring about the role of the state in the lives of its citizens. You know, what is the role of the state to support the American family when faced with challenges like educating children, caring for frail older adults, juggling two jobs, managing the cost of a frail older adult. And the battles over the welfare state, the quote, family values, the role of taxation, all would have as their sort of side victim, and I'll use the word victim strongly, persons living with Alzheimer's and their caregivers, because, for example, America has no long-term care social insurance program for long-term care. We have no social insurance program. We almost had one in the late 20th century, but it fell apart over partisan bickering, largely around issues around taxes. You know, we're not raising taxes. And if you have as your dominant philosophy, no new taxes, taxes are wrong, you're not going to be able to address a large social problem of a shared risk, namely the risk of needing long-term care. And so I think we're still living that drama right now, that partisan battle over what is the role of the state to assist people living with chronic disabling diseases like Alzheimer's disease.
Yes, you're right. Absolutely. And I never really realized all the components to that till reading your book. So this was eye-opening to me on a lot of those.
Yeah, thanks. I had a lot of fun putting it together. It really kind of got me. I'm not a historian, but I got deep into the history.
Sure. Yeah, it's fascinating. And then the personal stories, of course, are interesting too. And the heroes, you know, the researchers, the scientists, but also the advocates and the caregivers and the persons affected themselves, this theme of revolution. And I was going to ask on your own sort of revolutionary activity. You were going down the path of becoming critical care specialist, I believe, and then switch to sort of geriatrics, and tell us a little about how that happened.
Yeah. I will say you're right. Actually, much of the modern Alzheimer's movement got going not because of scientists saying, let's do something, although there was a scientist. He actually was kind of a failed researcher, no offense. Robert Katzman definitely got inspired, in part because of his own family experience. But it was essentially angry families that said, enough, the system is just failing us, that came together and said, we got to do something. What's interesting is most of those people were women, Hilda Pridgian and others. There was one man who's credited as the leader, Jerry Stone. He was extremely wealthy, very successful, hard driving, very smart. And I'll give him credit, but I would say that much of the modern Alzheimer's movement is the work of women determined to do something when faced with a spouse or a parent who needed help and they had nowhere to go to get help. Anyway, I was kind of like that as well. Namely, I was a critical care fellow at the University of Chicago studying to be an intensivist. And for reasons, there were several reasons professionally that I was beginning to get interested in aging. But really the thing that changed me was my grandfather. He had dementia, wasn't very well diagnosed. We kind of just went with the system, which was, not much. And he had a daughter, fortunately, who lived in town, who kind of looked after him. And anyway, he fell, broke his hip, went to a major leading academic medical center, and 6 months later was dead. And the events of his dementia, his fall, his fracture, the hospital care or lack of care, and that ensued, it kind of had me say, we don't need more critical care doctors. Believe me, we need critical care doctors. The events of the last 2 years have certainly shown that. But we need doctors to take care of frail older adults and their families. And I was interested in aging, and so I switched to geriatrics. And I will say, when I said that to the critical care program, they thought something was wrong, because no one leaves critical care to go into geriatrics. Geriatrics is undersubscribed. There are about 200 doctors every year who go into a fellowship, whereas critical care is a very competitive fellowship that fills up. And I'm not criticizing critical care. I am not. But I am saying I wanted to be part of a solution for something that I think was neglected. And I've never looked back on that decision with regret. Never looked back on it. And I think of my grandfather a lot.
Great. Awesome story. Yes. Heroes, definitely. So I wanted to talk a little on your idea that the disease, this is a disease affecting the autonomy of the person.
Yeah.
And you write that dementia is a disease of autonomy, and the lives of persons with it are an extended conversation over a question. What is a good life when you're losing your ability to determine that life for yourself? And you go on later in the book to say the disease is not an attack on the body, but on the mind and the person's self-determination and identity. And what we fear is the care we receive. You go into describing, being called sweetie and baby talk tones and all this elder speak stuff. That's
dressed in sports garments and pull-up pants and whatnot.
Yeah, wow, and so true. But you go on to say that this is what we fear: threats not to our life but to our dignity. I think that's profound and so true. Can you kind of unpack that a little for us?
Yeah, it was kind of everything I've said in the book about as a disease of the mind, a disease of autonomy. When I say it to people, they're like, yeah, you're right. But it's sort of just like restating the obvious. And I don't mean that to insult myself or my listener. But if you think about it, the stereotype of the disease is someone who can't bathe, dress, groom, feed, and toilet themselves, which is the very advanced stage of the disease. But in the years prior to that, what's a person living with the disease is experiencing is this incremental chipping away at their ability to experience the world, the physical, the experience of the world, as well as to make decisions and live in the world. In other words, they're losing their mind slowly. And that slow chipping away takes its form in very quotidian things. I mean, if you think about, like, all of you today at some point are going to say, huh, what do I want to have for dinner? And you're going to make a lot of decisions. You're going to say, you know, I think I'm going to cook. And then you're going to get the ingredients. You're going to cook an elaborate meal or not. Or you say, you know, I'm going out. And you're going to get in your car and you're going to drive and you're going to go to a restaurant. You're going to order. You're going to pay the bill, put a tip on the bill, and say that was a great meal. If you have in the earliest stages of this disease, those kind of things are chipped away at. Cooking becomes complicated. Things are burned. Meals are simple. You're not driving to get to the restaurant. It's hard to order off the menu, etc. I go on. And it's that chipping away at self-determination, which is the disease from the beginning. And what I've described is just the loss of your ability to exercise your autonomy, to live the life you want to live. It doesn't mean selfishly, it's to be with other people and say, you know, let's do this together or not. And that's what makes this disease a disease. And that's what I think people fear the most, which is the loss of that self-determination, as opposed to, for example, in cancer or heart disease, where fundamentally the fear, sure, it's the symptoms, you know, pain, weight loss, but once one can either have those treated or cope, it really is about death, just death, exiting the earth. But that's not the case with this disease. It's not about the death. It's about that loss of self-determination. And that's why it's such a distinct and peculiar disease. And that's why I like to think of it as a disease of our autonomy, which gets back to my earlier point. Unless societies widely recognize autonomy as something that people should have, that free will is something that is essential to human flourishing, it's hard to see Alzheimer's fully as a disease if you don't see that everyone should be able to have their free will and exercise their free will.
So true. Yeah, that's so true. You talk about solutions to this possibly, and in the book you say, to maintain independence in spite of this disease, we're going to have to accept some changes to the ways we exercise our autonomy. What does that look like? How describe that a little?
Yeah, there is an irony about Alzheimer's. And so one of the leading goals of the United States Alzheimer's plan, and we have a national plan to tackle the problem of Alzheimer's. It's been in place for about 7 years now. It's revised every year. Its first goal is to discover an effective treatment to prevent and effectively treat the disease. So the vision that we would have would be that long before you're not able to drive, balance your checkbook, prepare a meal, that the disease is diagnosed, like sort of the way we diagnose heart disease with various tests that even though you're feeling fine. And then intervene with a treatment that ideally slows the natural history of decline that's going to occur. Well, if you think about that strategy, that strategy means you're going to be labeled with the risk of developing disabling cognitive impairments before you actually are disabled. And it means that other people are going to know you're at risk. It means that other people I hope who care a lot about you, are going to watch over you to make sure you're doing okay, because over time you may develop problems. You know, short of a cure for each and every cause of cognitive impairment, I think just like with heart disease and cancer, we should expect people will still have these diseases, perhaps not as severe, and perhaps, you know, they don't progress as fast. That's our vision. And so the irony is we're going to have to allow other people to watch over each other, the system, the financial system, the transportation system, our families, to make sure we're doing okay. So we're going to actually have to surrender some degree of privacy, surrender some aspects of our identity to a system to watch over us. And so we have to create that system we trust. And then once we're disabled, wouldn't we like a system that steps in and helps us, that provides us a day that is safe, social, and engaged? And again, that requires creating a system that we're willing to be part of and that's willing to have us be part of it. And so, you know, the solution to this loss of our autonomy, this threat to our loss of our autonomy, is to interdigitate ourselves with other people to watch over us and to care for us. And so I think that's one of the ironies about this disease.
Exactly. Yeah, it is humbling, isn't it? It's a humbling disease, and it requires more than just the person. Like you're saying, it's going to involve a team or at least one other person.
Yeah, and so exactly. So for example, I have patients and family members who tell me they go to see a physician, and one of two extreme things happen. One is that the physician turns to the family members like, "You need to leave. This is my patient. This is who I'm going to talk to." Or even if the family member is there, they only will talk to the patient, and the family member is like, "You need to talk to me because sometimes the story isn't so complete, and I'm going to help you fill it in." Well, the other extreme is they don't talk to the patient at all. They talk about the patient in front of the patient, and they just talk to the family member. And so both are extreme and I think inappropriate, make extreme and inappropriate assumptions about what it's like to either be a patient, meaning you lack any ability to communicate, so you should just be ignored, or that because you're still a patient and a person, I have to make sure I only focus on you to the exclusion of this other person whose life is deeply intertwined with you. And that other person is the person, of course, that we call a caregiver. And so we have to set up a system that recognizes that the ideal way to live life is in some sort of dyad or triad intermesh with other people. It doesn't mean they have to be your spouse or your adult child, a friend, a companion, someone you're paying, but at least there's someone there that you're intermeshed with. And our healthcare system is not set up to allow that. I mean, we saw this with COVID, and I'm on a bit of a ramble. Visitation policies. Well, of course we should keep the visitors out because, they're just going to spread COVID and they're just there to visit, right? Well, not all visitors are just bringing the newspaper and a box of chocolates to the hospital or to the long-term care facility. Some visitors are there to do care. And, we saw this with residents of long-term care when the families were kept out. As hardworking as the staff were, we always knew they were understaffed. We always knew that they were stretched to the limits. And we always really secretly knew that the family was there to really make sure people were cared for. And once we kicked them out, and it was understandable in the early days of the pandemic, it was. But once we kicked them out and kept them out, people died. Not because of COVID necessarily, just because of lack of care.
Right. That's so, the caregiver is so integral, the family,
It is.
the team around them. And that opens my next question, actually. You described that a person with quadriplegia needs a wheelchair. A person with dementia also needs a device. We call it a caregiver. I love that. And then you go on to describe in the Penn Memory Center where you typically have an intake. You first interview the person separate from their family. And as you're interviewing the family member for that collaborative history, there's this empty chair phenomenon in the room. It signifies an ending and a beginning. I think this really is an epiphany moment, I would think, for caregivers. Can you elaborate on that ending and beginning that you talk about in the book?
Yeah. Yeah, it's ending being just, excuse the phrase just, it's ending being the wife, the husband, the partner, the mother, the sister, the brother, the best friend, and being that plus being caregiver. And that word, that term, that role. And I do think, we could debate the word, should it be carer, care partner? I don't think it should be caretaker because you're not taking care, you're giving care.
Right.
But I think that word or some word like it is very important to have and to not view it as, a problem. And although some caregivers resist being labeled a caregiver, and I can understand why, because it's sort of insulting to think, this is my dad, I have to give care. Why would I? It's just me being a good son or a good daughter or a good husband and I get that sentiment, but I think it's important that this role have a name and a label, because once you name something, you can describe it, you can measure it, you can identify it and help it, you can support it. And I think in communities where caregiving is not recognized as a distinct role, what you see are caregivers struggling because no one sees them as people with a role that needs to be attended to. It would be as if we didn't acknowledge the role of parents and we just said, well, that's just humans doing what humans do. And so, well, no, it's a parent. Parents need support. And if we don't support them, children suffer. And the word caregiver actually is incredibly modern. If you search on that word through lexical search engines that look at the frequency of a word in the English language. You can do that. It's really fun, actually. At least I think it's fun. The word caregiver doesn't appear until about 1980 in the English language. Prior to 1980, the word caregiver is really rarely, if ever, used in our lexicon. And of course, the deep irony there is that people have been caring for people since the beginning of people being humans. The book of Ruth in the Bible, the book of Ruth, Joshua judges Ruth. The book of Ruth is the story of Ruth, who is the daughter-in-law of her mother-in-law, Naomi. And Naomi, an elderly woman, is widowed, as is Ruth. And Naomi says to Ruth, well, I guess you're going to go back to your home city, your hometown, to find a husband. I'll be fine here. Just leave me be. She says, no, I'm not going back to find a new husband. I'm going to stay with you and I'm going to care for you. And that's what Ruth does. She cares for Naomi. And I would urge you to read the book of Ruth. Whether you believe the Bible is the written word of the Lord or not, the book of Ruth is the most elegant story of, frankly, a daughter-in-law struggling to take care of her mother-in-law in the face of being estranged and out of a job, etc. Well, no one ever in the Bible calls Ruth Naomi's caregiver. She's just a dutiful daughter-in-law doing what family does. And so I think I tell that story because I think there have been Ruths for centuries, but they were never acknowledged for what they were doing. And in America now, what you have are all these Ruths and Rods, to put a male name on it, who still struggle to do their work, and it is work of caregiving, unsupported by America, unsupported, struggling to figure out a system, struggling to get a voice for their relatives' care, struggling to put together a day that's safe, social, engaged, because there's not enough adult day activity programs. And so, yeah, caregiving is a distinct role. It's a role that needs to be supported. I was cautiously optimistic that the pandemic would have America realize that, but I don't see that happening, unfortunately.
Yeah, the caregiver is really a noble role, that's for sure.
Well, it's noble, yes, but I think I prefer to think of it as an existential dilemma, because I think, and this is from a spousal caregiver, he loved his wife, but he said, the struggle I face is an existential dilemma, which is I'm trying to do everything I possibly can for her and at the same time live my life. And you can't do both. His solution was to take on another partner, someone who would give him some of that emotional exchange, but at the same time do everything he could for his wife. And I don't view what he did as wrong. I view what he did as what you have to do when you're faced with an existential dilemma is you're never going to be able to do everything right. You're going to have to make some tough choices.
Yeah, those choices are difficult. You talk about the loved ones, caregivers having to make loving deceptions for their loved one to carry out, this has an effect both on the caree and the caregiver, right? And you point that out very well. Interestingly, you described that the caregiver actually controls the truth of the day. I suppose that's really profound. How do you counsel care partners, caregivers toward that role? Is there
So let me talk a bit about this idea of controlling the truth, because it is in some sense the case. I mean, I'll tell you where I first had this realization. I was years ago, I was watching a training video for doing an interview called the Clinical Dementia Rating. And it's a very standardized interview you do. And in the training video, there was this wife who was being interviewed by the physician and so you watch this to practice the interview. And he says to her, well, tell me about a recent event that's occurred in your life with your husband. And she talks about how they went up, they lived in St. Louis, how they went up to Chicago for a weekend family gathering. And they went to the Drake Hotel and had dinner. And she kind of goes like this. She says, yeah, he never would have liked that. He always didn't like to spend a lot of money on dinner, but it was my choice. And it made me realize like the intense authority that a caregiver has to decide, well, we're going to the Drake Hotel for dinner. And it goes beyond that. Like, they decide a lot of things about daily life, where we're going to go, what we're going to do, what you're going to wear, what you're not going to wear, etc. In some sense, they control the truth. What are you going to hear about or not hear about? Of course, early in disease, these things are subtle, if at all. But as the disease progresses, if it does, most caregivers realize they have to take on those roles. Otherwise, things fall apart. And so that, to me, is one of the fundamental moral challenges of caregiving. It's not just doing tasks, cooking the meal, paying the bill. It's these choices about what meal, what bills that they have to make. And that's the moral challenge of caregiving, these choices. And so in this control of truth, I mean, one of the most sort of ground zero examples of that is in some patients at some stage of the course of the disease, they can develop concerns about where relatives are who are dead. And they'll, for example, ask about a dead relative. When's mom coming home? Well, mother's been dead for 50 years. So what do? Do you say to them, mother's been dead for 50 years? Or do you say something else like, she'll be home in a half hour? And I think that's a dilemma caregivers struggle with. And the phrase, of course, is for she'll be home in a half hour is loving deceptions, And I get the logic of that term, which is, I am deceiving you, but it's out of my love for you that I'm doing it. And in the book, I talk about kind of a third way to address that. So do you tell the hard, cold truth, or do you deceive? My default is the truth, but I will tell you, I have plenty of patients where the truth hurts, and that doesn't work. So do you deceive? And the third way, and I describe it in the book, was created by my friend and colleague, Ann Basting. And Ann's the author of a book I highly recommend. I'll put it in the chat. It's called Creative Care. I'm going to put it in the chat. Creative Care. Oops. By Ann Basting, like the turkey basting. And Ann describes this approach called creative care, so I'll give you how it would work out. So when's mom coming home? Says the patient. I call patients because I'm a doctor. Says the person to their caregiver. And the creative care approach would say, well, if she were here, what would we do with her? So you're not lying and saying mom's dead or mom's coming home in a half hour, and you're not hammering mom with the truth, namely, mom's been dead. What are you talking about? You're just saying, well, if she were here, what would we do with her? And then take it from there. Spouse turns to their spouse and says, we were together all this time. We should probably get married. I've had patients turn to their spouse and say, we should probably get married because we spent so much time together. And of course, they're married. Well, that's devastating to hear, certainly. Well, one response to that is, well, who would we invite? And where would we have it? And what would we do? And just kind of take it from there creatively. And in general, her approach to creative care argues that a person with dementia, despite the fact that they have troubles with language and memory, working memory, if given support, can engage in creative acts with their caregiver. And it sort of transforms the experience of caregiving from being duty and task to being something creative. It may still be ugly in its own way, excuse the word, but at least it's got more meaning to it than just deceptions and or cold truth and and tongue and lip biting.
Right.
Well, and I don't mean to interject, but Andrea posted something very interesting in the chat, and she said when someone has heart disease or cancer, we provide them with no end of resources, nutritionists, alternative therapies, all of these sort of things that we don't necessarily provide to people who have Alzheimer's or dementia issues to care for. We just
Why is that? Well, I'll tell you why that is. Because and I know this personally. My mother had, I hope it's past tense, breast cancer, and we took her to Penn, where I work, to the cancer center, and I felt like someone who had come in out of like an underdeveloped nation into a developed nation. My memory center is in the same building, and it's okay. I walked to the cancer center. I'm like, wow, this is impressive. Well, why is that? Well, cancer has a business model. And that business model is driven by very lucrative diagnostics and therapeutics, and those generate revenue. Alzheimer's doesn't have the business model. It doesn't have lucrative therapeutics and diagnostics. So it's a very costly disease, especially since there's so many people who could come to a memory center. It'd be one thing if it was a rare disease. Well, the margin off of other profit will help pay for that small little clinic to take care of that small number of people. But for a vast disease like this, you just don't have that kind of margin to help pay for the loss that is a memory center. It doesn't have to be that way. And then the other reason why it's a struggle is a lot of the care that someone with Alzheimer's and related diseases needs is care in the community. And again, in America, access to long-term care services and supports is means tested. If you are poor enough, you will qualify for Medicaid. But in many states, you wait in line because Medicaid is underfunded to provide the long-term care services and supports. And if you're not poor enough to qualify for Medicaid, you pay out of pocket. And you just pay and pay and pay. And that's the way it is in this country. That's not the way it is in Japan and Germany, by the way. Many other countries have a system of long-term care services and supports paid out of a social insurance program, typically a payroll tax, which makes sense. If you've got a big risk spread out across your entire population, everyone can pay into that because that's how you sort of spread out a risk. But we don't have that in this country. And so that's why, to the questioners, that's why it's so bad out there compared to these other diseases.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really a good point. And you do talk about the need for even the non-pharmacologic programs, but education, the caregiver support, as well as the
yeah, I mean, if you get diabetes in America, you get access to a nutritionist to sit down and help you figure out how to put together a meal that balances calories, etc.
Right.
Why isn't that the case that at the memory center after diagnosis, I see you for a new patient visit, takes about an hour and a half, and I see you back in a month after we go over your consensus diagnosis with neuroimaging. I see you back in a month with your family members, and in the room with me is one of our social workers. And that social worker then meets with the family to help put together a care plan. Our social work team is made possible by a generous donation from a very wealthy, grateful patient, Eli Kaplan. If we didn't have that donation, they'd all lose their jobs in a month.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And I applaud those efforts and going on. Hopefully you pointing out some solutions going forward, whether it's social insurance or other programs to help fund this. I want to take time, though, before we run out of time, about the idea you were talking about Ann Basting's book and this redirection idea. Yeah. And I love the thought in your book comes up that imagination is still something folks affected with dementia can still exercise. And you were just giving an example with that. And, if we're all created in the image of God, creator, we all have creative imaginations. And you talk in your book about time slips and using these, having folks develop a play, come up with a poem. I just think that's so creative way to engage people.
Fascinating. The fourth part of the book's a 4-part book, and I have a whole chapter on Ann's work, as well as other things that can be done in society to make this disease livable. Let me make one very important point. I don't juxtapose care versus cure, okay? I think we should expect that someday we will have effective treatments for Alzheimer's disease and other diseases that slow the disease down, just like we have effective treatments for some cancers. Some are cures, some slow it down. But I still have family members who have died of cancer, and I have family members and neighbors, friends who have died of heart disease. We should expect effective treatments, but we're not going to drug our way out of each and every cause of disabling cognitive impairments. That's just not sound social scientific policy. So we're going to have to learn how to live with these diseases. And that's what I try to lay out in the book. Progress in drugs and progress in care. They should not be in competition. They should be together. And this care versus cure thing that unfortunately is kindled in this disease is a circle the wagons, aim inward and fire kind of approach, which is unacceptable.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. It's really true of balancing. I also want to make sure we have a little time to talk about technology, and that may be also a way to live with this disease.
How this disease will help you live with Alzheimer's, or this device, I should say, will help you live. Exactly.
Right, exactly. You call it sort of a cognitive prosthesis to use technology. And you go over lots of these in the book. It's really fascinating to discover the simple technologies to more complicated things as robotic dogs and Paro and the artificial intelligence care bots that are learning how to help their appointed person living with dementia. What do you see as these opportunities or hesitancies with using technology? Is our society really ready for this?
Well, it is and it isn't. I think all of us know how helpful these things are as memory devices and navigation devices. And I mean, I have some patients who, courtesy of these kinds of devices, are able to still do activities that if it wasn't for the device, they couldn't do. As well as devices that locate someone if they go beyond a sort of geographic area. I have a guy whose wife for a while, he just would allow her to wander in their yard. And the moment she exited the yard, he got a signal on his phone. She's going to go down the street, and he'd go out and get her. And that allowed her to wander in the yard and do other things that she enjoyed without him constantly having to watch her or lock her up in the house, which is what he did until he finally got that device. You know, I monitor my father's finances courtesy of an app I have to his bank, and I can look at every check he writes and just make sure he's still writing checks correctly and not writing too many checks to the wrong people, etc. You could go on. I mean, you know, if you're good enough, if Uber's apps is a little more usable, I find it sometimes a little kludgy. You know, you can get a car instead of having to drive, right? And not even worry about having to pay, because there's so many ways that our ability to interact with the world can be mediated by these devices. And I don't keep on featuring the iPhone, but I'm trying to keep on illustrating. Certainly the way we're communicating now is transformative, so there's a lot of promise to technology. I think some of the downsides, though, is that we tend to begin to think of technology as a way that substitutes for humans. And all these machines are just that. They're machines. They don't have a mind. They don't fully experience the world and think about the world the way this thing does. There's something about the human mind which is distinct. It knows the feeling of red, the smell of apple pie. It understands if I knew you, Susan, personally, I know who Susan is and what makes Susan tick. And so I think there's a real role for machines, but they can't supplant and substitute for the care that humans give. And so I think the challenge we're going to face going forward is how to sort of bring machines and humans together to work where the one doesn't supplant the other. And then a final concern I have about technology is technology also starts to interact with the individual and shape their world. And obviously, the people who control the technology, therefore, are controlling your world. And I think we have to be very thoughtful about what are the ways that we want technology to shape the world around us. And the example I give is, what if Ronald Reagan had a robot? Because, Reagan had Alzheimer's disease, and there's some stories I collect in the book of how he would ask questions about, say, George Shultz, his former Secretary of State who visited him. He didn't know who George Shultz was. And I kind of wonder, like, what if he had asked his robot, who is that person? What would the robot have said? And where would the robot have taken that conversation about who is that person? And so, in summary, I think there are clear roles for technology. But the challenges are how are they going to work with humans, not against humans, and not substitute for humans.
Great. Yeah. It's another balancing act, I suppose, at this point. Yeah. I did want to touch base, if we still have time, on some of the new research and discoveries that you get to, especially the aducanumab and the discovery that Alzheimer's is probably a heterogeneous disease. So maybe if you could speak a little to the, antibody saga.
I mean, in brief, a drug that's been approved by the FDA on June 7th of 2021 called aducanumab, marketed by Biogen as Aduhelm. It was a controversial approval for a number of reasons. I think most agree that the process of the approval was botched along many steps. Looking back, some of those errors were so egregious that the Office of Inspector General, the Department of Health and Human Services, is investigating it, and 2 congressional committees are investigating it. It was the kind of data set that I think said there's more to study here. We got to figure this out. And it was premature to put it out on the market. Well, it got put out on the market, but the market really kind of said, this drug doesn't seem to be a drug that we should prescribe. It's very interesting how across health systems, insurers, Europe and Japan, the drug's been kind of uniformly panned. The latest event is that the Center for Medicare Services, which essentially runs Medicare, issued a guidance for how they're going to pay for the drug, because of course it's FDA approved, so now does Medicare pay for it? And their guidance is that we'll pay for it if you're in a study to show whether the drug in fact works, as opposed to just covering it as they would cover a regular prescription. They're seeking comments on that proposal by February 12th, and then they'll close the comments and come back in April with a final decision. So it's an unfortunate saga that didn't have to happen. It's largely, I think, the result of a lot of power and not a lot of persuasion going on out there. Biogen needed a hit. They needed a blockbuster. FDA has been much more sort of tolerant around advancing innovation. Well, they call it innovation, but it's really investment. And it's going to be a lesson for how to think about realigning our drug system and drug approval. All right, that's a long ramble. I packed a lot into that. I think the bottom line is this. There are several drugs in the works under study, including aducanumab, which is under study still, if CMS gets its way, that I think have a promise that they could make a dent in the natural history of the disease. I talked about this earlier. So you take a statin drug, right? So I'll go back to my father. My father took a statin, takes a statin. He does. So that meant that the heart attack he had happened when he was 83, not when he was 73, right? So, I mean, I think that's the kind of world we have to anticipate, that this will be a druggable disease for some, not for all. For some, the drugs will be very effective. For some, not at all. Some won't tolerate them. And so, again, I come back to that point I made earlier. We're going to have to figure out how to learn to live with disabling cognitive impairments. And that's our challenge. That is the challenge of us. I'll leave you with this point. I'm happy to answer more questions. I'm not leaving. In some sense, the problem of Alzheimer's, the title of my book, the problem of Alzheimer's is us. It's our failure to realize how interconnected we are, our failure to take care of each other. It's our failure to make some tough choices. And so it kind of flips it back to us. This is ours to solve.
Good point. Wow. We all need to step up, right?
Yep.
So the other piece on the latest research is sort of this heterogeneity of what is Alzheimer's disease, that perhaps the least common form of Alzheimer's is Alzheimer's itself. So as the research community and the public really embraces this idea that, well, we're dealing with a heterogeneous disease, do you feel this is a broadening of opportunities for discovery and collaboration?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I believe in science. I don't believe in science. I think science, the more we learn about a disease, the more we understand what it is and what it isn't and how to approach it. And you're right. You know, Alzheimer's defined pathologically is a very specific set of 2 pathologies, and I describe it in the book. And many patients who have those pathologies, we find also have other pathologies in their brain. So it's not to just diminish the role of Alzheimer's in causing dementia. It's just to recognize that it's one among several causes and one among several targets to go after in an effort to treat the disease. Now, maybe one of those targets is actually the unifying target. If you can go after tau, you'll solve this whole thing. You know, it's one of the pathologies. Don't worry about the specifics. But again, that's why we do research. You know, there's an expression, "In God we trust, everyone else bring data." And let's never forget that, you know, despite desperation, and boy, this is a disease of desperation, and the desire for hope. In the end, you know, we should be persuading each other with data, not power.
Right. Excellent. So I want to invite people to put questions into the chat, of course. And
Yeah,
while you're
I'll
doing
cruise
that,
into
I
the
have
chat and just see there too.
I
Yeah,
have a
and I've been
question while
monitoring
we're-
the chat, and we don't necessarily have any specific questions, but there are some great resources being shared there
Yeah.
with people. So make sure you take a look at the chat. The Idaho ADRD Alliance has got a meeting coming up, and so that information is in there. And also the link for the Greater Idaho chapter of the Alzheimer's Association, who has numerous resources for caregivers and people who are diagnosed, and courses available. So we're making sure that we're sharing all of those things, and I will make sure that all of those links and things get shared out in an email with this recorded event.
Great, thanks. And while we're waiting for that, I was going to ask, just as far as prevention, in a way, you do talk about the idea that 35 and maybe 40% of lifetime risk of developing dementia is modifiable.
Let me put into the chat, everyone, Global Council on Brain. So you want to figure out what kind of things do and don't help your brain. I just put in the chat AARP's Global Council on Brain Health. It's a website. It nicely summarizes the data on a host of different activities that are either that have been purported to help with your brain health, and lays out what really does and doesn't help with brain health. There's no surprises there. You're not, but I think that I highly recommend it. It is like the go-to. It's very user friendly. It's for the public. It's not a professional site. That is to say, the materials are very readable and get right to the point of what works and what doesn't. And then there are reports that you can read if you want more information. So I definitely recognize Global Council and recommend the Global Council on Brain Health. If you want to go and learn more about what I do, by the way, I'll put it in the chat. There's my website. It's just myname.com, jasonkarlawish.com. And the book is available in hardback. It's also an ebook and an audiobook too. And I actually read the first and last chapters. If you want to hear my voice more, you can get the audiobook. It'll be out in paperback in November as well. So
Great. So there is a question about nutrition. Can you comment on seeing the plethora of nutritional recommendations for prevention and treatment? Any books, videos, etc.
Yeah, again, the Global Council on Brain Health has a whole section on diet with an emphasis on what diets have been shown to be associated with brain health and versus not. And again, I don't mean to be dismissive, like just go to the website, but truly go to the website. I will say that the United States National Alzheimer's Plan now has a new goal number 6, which is reduction of risk and promotion of prevention. And so the U.S. now has taken on brain health as one of the goals of our National Alzheimer's Plan. That's a big step in the right direction, in a right direction, not the right direction. Yeah.
Definitely. Great. Yeah, you do talk about creating cognitive reserve, greater cognitive reserve as a biologic argument for a public policy, which I think is amazing. To prevent dementia, we really ought to make a more robust investment in education and cognitively stimulating venues, etc. That's fascinating.
No, this isn't just entertainment and sideshow. This is about our brain health. You know,
right?
You go to a community where there's no sidewalks, and so getting out to walk around is discouraged effectively. You found a community that's not that brain healthy.
Wow, that's really true. That's good. So Andrea is asking a question specifically about the woman in your book that you mentioned, was able to take pills and end her life. She's wondering where that was and its legality here in the States or not.
So in the book, I recount a patient who ended her life. She had mild cognitive impairment, and I explain in the book what that is, caused by Alzheimer's. And as she felt she was getting sicker and sicker, having more cognitive problems, she decided to end her life. She had planned this out. It was very deliberate. It was not an impulsive act. She had squirreled away the pills from, getting, people over time accumulate various bottles. And so that's how she did it. It was very much a private act, as you will. It was not done under, say, in a state. 50% of America now has access to physician aid in dying. meaning if you meet certain criteria, the physician can write you a prescription, typically for Seconal, which will kill you if you take it. It'll end your life. Oregon is one of those states, but California, it's about 50% of the US population now lives in states that give access to that. None of those states allow that physician aid in dying to be given to people who are not. In all those states, you have to be able to make the choice, ask for it, take the medication, and have been certified, excuse the phrase, as having 6 months or less to live. That would largely put out people with Alzheimer's, because when they have maybe 6 months or less to live, they're not able to typically make that decision to end their life. They're not able even to take the medication, many of them. And so essentially, physician aid in dying is not available for people with Alzheimer's disease, with people with dementia. There was a proposal in Oregon to expand the law to make it available for people with neurological diseases that were considered terminal long prior to when they were terminal. The law has been brought up twice and never made it out of committee. And in the book, I explore the sort of ethics and politics around this topic, not in the depth I wanted to, but enough, I think, to provoke the reader to say, this is going to be a really big issue. I think right now, we're not ready as a country to make policy on this. I think our understanding of what it's like to be a person living with dementia is so stigmatized and misunderstood that it would be like making public policy in an era when you still have serfs and don't think of certain people as people. You're going to come up with some bad decisions because you don't even fully recognize some people as people. Nonetheless, I get the sentiment for people wanting to have access to aid in dying. So anyway, great question.
Here's another good question. And thank you, folks, Brenda and Lisa, for your comments and resources. Kyle is asking, can you speak to the role of multi-generational housing and how it might relate to the future of caregiving in the US?
I suspect Kyle has some ideas, because usually when people ask me questions that are that thoughtful, they have an idea. But, I think there's medical schools in Holland that give medical students housing in residential long-term care settings. And so you're a student, you're training to be a doctor, and you're actually going to, for your dorm room, live in this long-term care setting. And they do it, it's obviously done to integrate a doctor in training with what amounts to a whole host of people who could be or would be his patients or her patients. And I think there's a certain wisdom and logic to that. I think we do really need to rethink the concept of home for older adults. Kyle's suggestion around multi-generational housing is one of them. Another is to think about, how home-like are those places? Some of them are not very home-like. They're more like hospital settings than they are like a home. And I think we need to think about how families may, right now the American family is spread out and dispersed. How can we create a housing infrastructure that allows people to sort of come back together again? So yeah, I think there's a lot of creative ideas out there around architecture, design, and supporting housing that can help not just the older adult, but frankly the younger adult, as in the case of the medical students who are, their dorm room is in a long-term care setting.
Well, there has been the community in the Netherlands where it's a closed community, but it's got a park and stores, and it's an open place for people to go to the grocery store and to sit in the park and to have a semblance of a controlled truth.
Yeah, that's the famous Hoedwijk, which is a long-term care residence in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands in general, not just Hoedwijk, but their adult day activity programs, their approach relies on taste and aesthetics, not on a common approach in America more and more, which is deception. So in America, we're building these residential long-term care facilities to look like Philadelphia in 1950. or to look like San Diego in 1940, or to look like Sharon, Connecticut in 1960. And so, and everything, oh, isn't this neat? They live in the past, and so they walk in, and it's like, oh, you know, they're, and that's of course architectural deception. Like, let's make it look like it's 1940. I mean, literally in San Diego, the Glenner adult day activity program, the library has Eisenhower's photo on the wall, and the National Geographic stop in the 1960s, and the card. I mean, it is like deception writ large, and I get the sentiment behind that, but what I think I like about the Dutch approach is they say, well, look, Karlawish is kind of a modernist. He's always liked modern aesthetic, et cetera. So let's have adult day activity programs where the design and the feel of it is a modernist design. In contrast, Rebecca, she's all about the West, you know, and, you know, it's about a place that looks like a Western ranch. So let's have an adult activity program that has kind of a Western ranch feel to it. So it's not about deceiving Rebecca or Jason to pretend that I'm living in 1970 New Jersey, which is the time I grew up, but it's about giving me the environment that resonates with my sense of aesthetic and whatnot. And I think that Dutch approach has a lot to say for it.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And Kyle adds about in the chat, everyone can read as far as built-in childcare for grandchildren with those multi-generational pieces again, but the aesthetics are important.
Well, I hate to stop.
Gavel it to a close, as they say.
But we do need to bring this to a close. I would like to thank everybody.
Yeah,
for
Susan has been a great. Susan, you're a great interlocutor. So if you want a second career, seriously.
Fascinating book. Seriously.
Well, no, but start reading, continue reading fascinating books, and invite the authors. You've got to. I've done several of these events, and you can tell right away whether they A, read the book, and B, figured it out. And you definitely read it, and you also figured it out. So thank you.
Yes, I would like to thank all of you for taking the time to join us to kind of start this conversation. I've been making a list of all of the amazing resources that have been dropped into the chat, and I will make sure that I put this list together, and I will email it to everybody who has registered for this event, along with the recorded link for the event. So I want to make sure that we're sharing all of this brain trust, and we're able to take it out into the wider world and do what Jason said is make this a part of a conversation that has to happen, and us taking responsibility for making change.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone.
Dr. Melchior, thank you so much for your time. Steve,
okay.
Thank you, everybody. Be kind, take good care of yourselves, read good books, support authors, and support small businesses. And please keep your eye out and join us again. Thank you all very much.
Bye.